Close your eyes and imagine the London of your dreams. You see the majestic Big Ben towering over the mist, the elegant sweep of silk dresses on polished ballroom floors, and the sophisticated silhouette of Sherlock Holmes under a street lamp. This is the Victorian era the movies sold you, a time of unparalleled progress, rigid honor, and golden prosperity. But as the sun sets over the British Empire, the gold begins to flake away, revealing a rusted, decaying reality underneath. To step into 19th century London wasn't just a trip back in time. It was a descent into a labyrinth of shadows where your wealth determined if you breathed air or poison. Welcome to the Victorian Nightfall, where the dream ends and the nightmare begins. The first thing that would break you wouldn't be the poverty or the crime. It would be the air itself. Modern lungs, accustomed to filtered vents and emission standards, would seize up within minutes of stepping onto a London street in 1880. This wasn't fog, it was the Great Smog, a thick, yellowish blanket of coal smoke, sulfur, and industrial waste. They called them Pea Soupers because of their sickly greenish-yellow hue. It was so dense that it didn't just obscure your vision, it felt like a heavy, wet wool blanket pressed against your face. You would cough until your throat bled, tasting the soot of 10,000 factory chimneys with every gasp. In this era, fresh air was a myth reserved for the dead. Walking through a Victorian night was a literal game of life and death. When the smog descended, visibility dropped to less than an arm's length. You could hear the world around you, the rhythmic clip-clop of invisible horses, the distant screams of the docks, but you were blind. Men walked into brick walls, horses panicked and trampled pedestrians, and, most terrifyingly, hundreds of souls simply walked off the edge of the quays, plunging into the freezing, oily waters of the Thames. They disappeared into the darkness without a sound, claimed by the river because they couldn't see the ground beneath their feet. The city was a predator, and the fog was its camouflage. As night took hold, the lamplighters would begin their rounds. They carried long poles to ignite the gas-fed lanterns that lined the main thoroughfares. To a modern observer, the yellow, flickering glow might seem romantic, but in reality it was eerie and insufficient. The gaslight didn't illuminate the street. It merely created small, isolated islands of amber light in a sea of black. Beyond that circle of light, anything could be waiting. The flickering flames cast long, distorted shadows that danced against the soot-stained brickwork, making the city feel like it was breathing. It was a world of high contrast, blinding light and absolute, terrifying darkness. Listen closely to the Victorian night. It is a cacophony of industrial progress and human misery. You hear the iron-rimmed wheels of handsome cabs grinding against the wet cobblestones, a sound that vibrates through your very bones. You hear the night watchman ringing his bell, a lonely sound that emphasizes how truly unsafe the streets are. But underneath the mechanical noise, there is the organic sound of the city, the cough of a child sweeping a chimney, the rustle of a silk skirt passing a beggar, and the constant, rhythmic thumping of the steam engines that never stop. It is the sound of a machine that consumes people as fuel. By the time you reached your lodgings, your skin would be stained gray with soot, and your clothes would smell of sulfur and horse manure. You would realize that the Gilded Age was only gilded on the surface. Underneath the lace and the top hats was a society struggling to breathe, literally and metaphorically. The Victorian night invites you to look closer at the soot on the window pane and the shadows in the alleyway. This is the world Silas has just entered, and as he lights his first candle in the gloom of Ironmonger Lane, he realizes the truth. In London, the night doesn't just fall, it swallows you whole. This second chapter moves from the air to the water, focusing on the literal and metaphorical gut of the city. To match the style of medieval times discovered, we will use visceral descriptions, medical horrors, and the great stink as the central conflict. If the Victorian air was a lung-burning poison, the water was a silent executioner. In the mid-19th century, the River Thames was not the scenic backdrop you see on postcards today. It was a 200-mile-long open sewer. Every ounce of waste from a population of 3 million people, human excrement, animal entrails from slaughterhouses, and toxic chemicals from tanneries, flowed directly into the river. It was a thick, black, bubbling soup of decay. During the summer, the heat would cook this cocktail, releasing a stench so powerful it would eventually shut down the British Parliament. They called it the Great Stink, a smell so foul it was said to be a physical force capable of knocking a man unconscious. Now imagine being a thirsty laborer in a London slum. You don't have a filtration system or a plastic bottle. You have a bucket. You walk down to the nearest pump, and out comes a liquid that is cloudy, yellowish, and smells faintly of the graveyard. This was the drinking water for millions. At the time, even the most brilliant doctors believed in the miasma theory, the idea that diseases were spread by bad smells. They didn't know that the real killer was invisible, swimming in their tea and soup. Every sip was a game of Russian roulette, with microscopic monsters that the Victorian world wasn't yet prepared to fight. When the monster struck, it didn't discriminate. Cholera was the terror of the Victorian age. One day, you were healthy. The next, your body was violently purging every ounce of fluid it contained. It was a brutal, dehumanizing way to die. Your skin would turn a haunting shade of blue as your blood thickened like sludge, and your eyes would sink deep into your skull. In 1854, the Broad Street outbreak killed 616 people in a matter of weeks. The city was paralyzed by fear, watching as entire families were carried away in pine coffins, never realizing that the source of the agony was the very pump they visited every morning. Long before the modern sewer systems we take for granted, London relied on the nightmen. These were the brave, desperate souls who worked while the city slept, emptying the thousands of brick-lined cesspits hidden beneath the floorboards of Victorian homes. Imagine a hole in your basement, 10 feet deep, filled with years of family waste. When it overflowed, the liquid would seep into the walls and foundations, turning your home into a tomb of bacteria. The nightmen would climb down into these pits by candlelight, shoveling the filth into buckets to be hauled away. It was backbreaking, nauseating work, and the fumes alone could, and often did, kill them where they stood. As the era progressed, the wealthy began to install the new water closets, the ancestors of our modern toilets. But there was a fatal design flaw. These toilets were connected to old, decaying sewers that weren't designed to handle the volume. Methane gas would build up in the pipes, trapped by the pressure. There are recorded instances of Victorian gentlemen sitting down for their morning business, only for a spark from a nearby candle or a surge in pressure to cause the toilet to literally explode. It was the ultimate Victorian irony. The very symbol of modern progress could, in an instant, become a lethal weapon. The tragedy of the Thames eventually forced the hand of the empire. After years of death and the unbearable stench of 1858, an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette undertook one of the greatest feats of the century, building the London sewer system. It was a massive underground cathedral of brick and iron that finally diverted the waste away from the drinking water. But for the thousands already buried in unmarked graves, the progress came too late. As Silas stares at his glass of water on Ironmonger Lane, he sees the sediment swirling at the bottom. A reminder that in this city, even the simplest necessity is a luxury bought with the price of 1,000 lives. In the Victorian era, there was one color that everyone craved: Shields green. It was a vibrant emerald hue that looked stunning under the new gaslights of London's ballrooms. You would find it everywhere, in plush sofas, elegant curtains, and most famously in the exquisite wallpapers that adorned every fashionable home. But this brilliance had a dark secret. The pigment was made from copper arsenite. You weren't just living in a green room, you were living inside a poison box. As the damp London air hit the walls, the wallpaper would release clouds of arsenic dust and toxic gas. Families would sit down for dinner, breathing in a slow, silent killer that caused headaches, skin lesions, and eventually a mysterious, lingering death. The danger didn't stop at the walls. It clung to the very skin of the socialites. A fashionable lady's ball gown could contain as much as 900 grains of arsenic, enough to kill dozens of people. As the wearer danced and sweated in the heat of the ballroom, the poison would be absorbed through her pores. The result was horrific: painful ulcers, hair loss, and the dropsy. But the gowns weren't the only threat. Men wore top hats stiffened with mercury, leading to tremors and hallucinations, the real origin of the Mad Hatter. Every thread of Victorian high fashion was woven with a thread of mortality. To be beautiful in the 19th century was to be pale, a sign that you were wealthy enough to never work under the sun. To achieve this ghostly look, women applied thick layers of enamel or white powders. The primary ingredient? Lead. This Venetian ceruse didn't just sit on the skin, it corroded it. Over time, the lead caused the skin to turn gray and shriveled, forcing women to apply even thicker layers to hide the damage. Beneath the beautiful mask, the poison was rotting their gums, causing their teeth to fall out, and attacking their nervous systems. The pursuit of a timeless beauty was, in fact, accelerating their journey to the grave. The Victorian obsession with dreamy highs led to one of the era's most dangerous beauty hacks. Women would drop extracts of Atropa belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, directly into their eyes to dilate their pupils. This gave them a wide-eyed, seductive look that was highly prized. However, the side effects were far from romantic. Constant use led to blurred vision, heart palpitations, and permanent blindness. They were literally sacrificing their sight to be looked at, wandering through the gaslit streets in a haze of toxic beauty. Perhaps the strangest trend of all was the deliberate consumption of poison. Some believed that eating small amounts of arsenic would give them a blooming complexion and sparkling eyes. It became a Victorian version of a wellness supplement. They would take arsenic complexion wafers, convinced they were improving their health while their internal organs were slowly failing. It was a society so obsessed with the appearance of life that they became comfortable flirting with the tools of death. The final irony of Victorian fashion was the mourning veil. When a husband died, a widow was expected to wear heavy black crepe for years. The dye in this fabric was often unstable and highly toxic. As the widow cried, the black dye would run down her face and into her mouth and eyes, causing skin irritation and respiratory problems. Even in their grief, the Victorian world found a way to make the survivors suffer. As Silas walks through a room decorated in Shields green, he notices a faint, garlic-like smell in the air, the unmistakable scent of arsenic. He realizes that in this era, the most dangerous place isn't the dark alleyway. It's the comfort of your own parlor. While the wealthy children of Mayfair played with porcelain dolls, a different army of children was being consumed by the city. In Victorian London, childhood wasn't a phase of life. It was a luxury most couldn't afford. As soon as a child could walk, they were seen as a pair of hands that could be put to work. These weren't just jobs. They were death sentences disguised as wages. From the soot-filled chimneys to the deafening floors of the textile mills, the Industrial Revolution was built on the backs of those who hadn't yet learned to read. The gears of greed didn't just manufacture cloth and steel, they manufactured orphans. Imagine being 5 years old and forced to climb into a dark, suffocating stone tunnel only 7 inches wide. This was the life of a climbing boy. To ensure they climbed faster, some masters would light small fires beneath their feet. These children scraped their knees and elbows raw against the jagged soot, breathing in black dust that would eventually rot their lungs or cause chimney sweeps cancer. Many became stuck and suffocated in the silence of a chimney flue. Their bodies recovered only when the walls were torn down. They were the forgotten ghosts of the Victorian hearth, cleaning the fireplaces of people who never bothered to learn their names. Below the grand bridges of London, another class of children existed, the mudlarks. These were the poorest of the poor, children between the ages of 6 and 15, who spent their days wading through the waist-deep, freezing mud of the River Thames at low tide. Barefoot and dressed in rags, they scavenged for anything they could sell: lumps of coal, old rope, copper nails, or bones. They walked through a mixture of industrial waste and human excrement, their feet constantly cut by broken glass and rusted iron. A good day's work might earn them a few pennies, just enough to buy a loaf of stale bread, while the constant threat of the rising tide loomed over them like a silent predator. Inside the great factories of the north, the noise was so loud it could make your ears bleed. Children known as scavengers and piecers worked beneath the massive moving power looms. Their job was to crawl under the machinery while it was still running to pick up loose cotton or tie broken threads. One wrong move, one moment of exhaustion, and the iron gears would catch a limb or a head. The machines didn't stop for screams. These children worked 16-hour shifts, fueled by nothing but thin porridge and the fear of the overseer's strap. They grew up deformed, their spines bent and their legs bowed from a life spent crouching in the dark. In the East End, hundreds of women and young girls worked in match factories, dipping wood into vats of white phosphorus. The fumes were lethal. Over time, the phosphorus would settle into their gums, causing their jawbones to literally rot away. This was the dreaded phossy jaw. Their faces would swell, their teeth would fall out, and in the dark, their infected bones would actually glow a sickly neon green. The only cure was to remove the entire jawbone before the infection reached the brain. It was a haunting price to pay for a world that simply wanted a cheap way to light a candle. As the sun sets over the London docks, Silas watches a group of exhausted children trudging home, their faces so blackened by soot and grease that they look like shadows themselves. He realizes that the progress of the 19th century is a hungry beast that never stops eating. Every steam engine, every mile of railway, and every bolt of lace is stained with the sweat of someone who died before they became an adult. In the Victorian world, the machine is the master, and the humans are merely the oil that keeps the gears turning. The gears of greed continue to grind, indifferent to the lives they crush beneath them. If you fell ill in the Victorian era, the hospital was not a place of healing. It was a gateway to the afterlife. Before the widespread acceptance of the germ theory, surgeons were judged by the speed of their knives and the amount of dried blood on their aprons. A surgeon would move from an autopsy of a diseased corpse directly to a living patient without washing his hands or his tools. To them, the hospital smell of rotting flesh and chemicals was simply the scent of progress. In the crowded wards, infections like gangrene and hospital fever spread like wildfire. To enter a Victorian operating theater was to accept a gamble where the house and the bacteria always won. For those who couldn't afford a doctor, the local chemist offered miracle cures that were often more dangerous than the disease. To soothe a crying infant, mothers were sold Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, a potent cocktail of morphine and alcohol. It worked perfectly. The children stopped crying because they were heavily drugged, and many never woke up. For adults, mercury was prescribed for skin conditions, and arsenic for tired blood. Heroin was marketed as a non-addictive cough suppressant. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a collection of poisons, a silent arsenal that slowly eroded the health of a nation in the name of relief. Before the reliable use of anesthesia, surgery was a brutal public spectacle. A leg amputation had to be performed in under 2 minutes to prevent the patient from dying of shock or blood loss. The most famous surgeon of the time, Robert Liston, once performed an operation with a 300% mortality rate. He amputated the patient's leg, who died of infection, accidentally cut off his assistant's fingers, who also died of infection, and slashed the coat of a spectator who died of a heart attack from pure terror. In the Victorian theater of pain, the line between a cure and an execution was razor thin. Death was so common in London that the city literally ran out of room for the dead. Graveyards were packed so tightly that bodies were buried just inches below the surface, and the smell of decay would waft into nearby houses. This led to the creation of the Magnificent Seven, massive, park-like cemeteries on the outskirts of the city, like Highgate. But even in death, the Victorian obsession with status remained. If you were poor, you were thrown into a pauper's pit with dozens of others. If you were rich, you built a stone fortress of a tomb, terrified that resurrection men would dig you up to sell your body to medical schools. As Silas stands on the Westminster Bridge, watching the last gaslight flicker in the pre-dawn mist, he sees the city for what it truly is. London is a beautiful, gilded cage built on a foundation of bone and soot. He sees the smoke rising from the factories, the black water of the Thames, and the pale faces of those who will not survive the winter. The Victorian era was a paradox, a time of steam engines and seances, of grand empires and starving children, of brilliant scientists and doctors who didn't wash their hands. It was the birth of the modern world, but the labor pains were agonizing. The Victorian Nightfall is not just a time of day, It is a reminder of how far we have climbed out of the darkness. As the sun finally begins to break through the thick, sulfurous clouds, the dream of the 19th century fades, leaving behind only the lessons of its cruelty. We look back at their gaslit streets and velvet parlors with a mixture of nostalgia and horror, grateful for the thin line of history that separates us from their struggle. The lantern is extinguished now, but the shadows it casts still linger in the corners of our world. Sleep well, knowing that when you wake, the air will be clear, the water will be pure, and the Victorian night is finally over.